Hello and welcome to MehtaEthics. David Benatar's axiological asymmetry can be quite hard to wrap one's head around. It's become the source of endless debate amongst natalists and anti-natalists alike, with many dismissing it as pure nonsense and others treating it like an objective fact. Today I'll be attempting to provide a defense of the asymmetry and answer why I accept it. The crux of the issue is that David Benatar's asymmetry is descriptive, not prescriptive. It is one of three main ways to evaluate the event of coming into existence. We can label these the Benatarian evaluation, the neutral evaluation, and the utilitarian evaluation. Benatar is of the belief that most people share his evaluation, but when engaged in an argument, many people propose the other two. I'll start with a bit of background about my meta-ethical beliefs. I'm a moral anti-realist. This is also called moral nihilism or moral subjectivism. This means that, although I do have a conception of good and bad, it's grounded only in my preferences. I don't believe that morality is objective, or that things can be good or bad stance independently. I also take the person-affecting view, which states that something can only be good or bad for someone, or from someone's perspective. This doesn't have to be from someone actually living, it could be a hypothetical person. If we limit our scope to utility, I believe it's good to increase the utility of all beings who already exist, but I don't care about creating more people just to increase the amount of utility in the universe. I don't think you necessarily have to have my exact normative ethics to accept Benatar's asymmetry, but I just wanted to disclose where I'm coming from. I'll start by constructing Benatar's asymmetry step by step. Benatar's asymmetry invites us to consider two possible scenarios, A and B. In scenario A, X exists. They will experience pain, which is bad. Represented visually, it looks like this. We can then compare scenario A with scenario B, where X never exists. Here they will have an absence of pain, which Benatar evaluates as good in comparison to the presence of pain. In other words, missing out on pain by not existing is good. We must of course also consider that in scenario A, X will experience a presence of pleasure, which is good. Now to complete Benatar's asymmetry, we then consider that X will have an absence of pleasure. Missing out on pleasure they would have experienced had they existed is considered not bad on Benatar's view, who says that an absence of pleasure is only bad if there is somebody to be deprived of it, and that this is an accurate depiction of people's values.
What I'm saying is these people that are married, that don't have children, they're not harming anyone. They're not harming these unborn children that they never have. They're not harming anyone.
From this asymmetry, Benatar states that coming into existence is always a harm, and has no benefits over not coming into existence. One more thing to add is that pleasure and pain could be replaced by rights violations or preference satisfaction, and the asymmetry would remain intact. Before we go any further, I want to make some minor modifications. Not bad can be somewhat confusing, so I just prefer to think of that as neutral. I'll also go ahead and color code the asymmetry for clarity. So now that we've established how Benatar evaluates coming into existence, we might ask why we should be convinced this is really the case. Why would the absence of pain be good for a non-existent being if the absence of pleasure is just neutral? Here's where we tend to run into some challenges, and where I notice the topic often falls apart. We need to remember that the asymmetry is not an asymmetry in what is objectively right and wrong, but an asymmetry in what Benatar values and potentially what humans in general tend to value. Benatar is not making a prescription that this is the case, he is describing human values. But when the asymmetry is challenged, anti-natalists often miss this and cling to it, assuming it's just true. As a moral anti-realist, it is my position that this disagreement just reduces down to a difference in values. We have to accept that there are actually many ways to value coming into existence against never existing, and many alternatives we could propose to the asymmetry presented by Benatar. Instead of just writing them off, let's concede that it's not the case that everybody must accept Benatar's asymmetry.
So my main problem with Benatar's, this Benatar table, it's that you may not just necessarily agree with it, and I don't personally agree with it. I'd say that the amount of possible well-being that we could achieve would far outweigh any suffering we could achieve.
We can then ask, if they do reject it, what must they accept as a consequence? Looking at the implications of other evaluations against the Benatarian evaluation won't convince everybody, but is a much better way to clear up this issue than just dismissing it without a convincing reason. We will now discuss some of these alternative evaluations. Benatar's asymmetry could have all evaluations removed, which would give us this template. We know how Benatar feels in this template, and we call this the Benatarian evaluation. By now, hopefully it's obvious where I'm going with this. You could actually fill in this template 81 different ways to construct alternative evaluations. Now, most of these would seem so ridiculous that nobody would embrace them, like this one, where pain is good and pleasure is always bad. However, there are two main alternatives that I do see defended quite regularly. We can call these the neutral evaluation and the utilitarian evaluation. What if we proposed that the absence of pain is not good for somebody who doesn't exist? It is neutral, just like the absence of pleasure. This initially seems like a convincing escape. However, I do not accept it. Let's consider the further implications of granting this neutral evaluation. If both squares in scenario B are neither good nor bad, just neutral, then it would never be better to have not existed. To understand why, we must remember that in scenario B, we are not talking about X's actual state of being, but rather we're talking about how we feel about the absence of what otherwise would have been present in scenario A. For it to be better to have not existed due to great suffering, we would need to value the absence of that suffering, not consider the absence neutral. We can take this to the extreme and use the case of factory farmed animals, living their whole lives in what is essentially torture. At birth, pigs are separated from their mothers and have their genitals and teeth cut out with no anesthesia. From there, they lived in cramped and unsanitary conditions, often covered in their own feces, until at a fraction of their natural lifespan, they are forced into an overcrowded truck with no water as they suffer the sweltering heat, only to have their throats slit. It seems clear to me that this pig would have been better off never existing. I would consider the absence of their suffering good, and I suspect most other people would as well. But let's say we did have an outlier who was happy to accept that it's never better to have not existed. In this case, we could run a thought experiment where we scale a potential being's negative utility up infinitely. Imagine literally infinite torture, all condensed into one being. Would you really not consider it good for the being to have not been created? It sounds like an extremely tough bullet to bite. Sometimes this evaluation is raised by people who want to claim that, in scenario B, Benatar is conflating a counterfactual with an actual scenario, and thus deploying a double standard. Claims about a double standard also fail against my view, which I believe to be the view that Benatar holds. It would be a double standard to compare hypothetical pleasure against actual pain, but this is not what is occurring. Instead, if you take my view, you are saying that you positively value the absence of pain, but consider the absence of pleasure to be neutral. There is nothing contradictory about this, and no double standard being deployed. Benatar may be somewhat to blame for this misunderstanding due to his phrasing. The absence of pleasure is not bad because there is no one to be deprived of it. However, I don't believe he's saying that if there's no one to be deprived of something, then it is neutral. That would be inconsistent, because of course there being no one deprived holds true for both pleasure and pain. He may only be saying that in the case of pleasure, there being no one deprived of it renders the lack of pleasure neutral, but this is not the case for pain. There is another proposed reconstruction of Benatar's asymmetry, which I will now discuss. We can get there by proposing that yes, the absence of pain is good, but the absence of pleasure is bad. This version allows us to point to an example such as the factory-farmed pig and say that their life is not worth beginning because the pain they will experience drastically overwhelms the pleasure they will experience, so it does not succumb to that reductio. Peter Singer possibly holds this view.
If it's a bad thing to bring the miserable child in the world, I'm inclined to say it's a good thing to bring the happy child into the world.
He also believes there is a need to simply increase the amount of utility in the universe. The universe would be better with more utility.
When you say we can reflect on the nature of pleasure and see that it's good, what does that adjective actually mean?
If we're prepared to talk about values, it means that the universe is a better place if it has that in it, and I would say if it has more of it in it.
Better in what? Like better for you? Sure,
No, better full stop. I don't want to say that all values are only values for someone.
I like what Abal Essiel has to say on the topic.
If the universe would be better off with more of it, then it's good. That is an answer just as crude and just as stupid as saying, if it's good for God, if it's good for Moses, if it's good for Zeus, if it's good for Indra, then it's objectively good. All you're doing is appealing to an abstract sock puppet, an abstract hand puppet, shall we say, that is a stand-in for your own judgment.
As I previously described, I stand in opposition to this. I take Singer's position to be a quasi-religious view because it ascribes a sense of purpose to the universe. On my nihilistic view, utility can only be good for someone, not for the universe, a mindless vacuum of space. This is why to me it's unclear whether Singer actually takes this reconstruction. The reconstruction is specifically about whether it is good or bad for the being brought into existence, and he may instead be talking about it being better to come into existence insofar as it will increase the net utility of the universe. And these positions are actually compatible. For example, you may think that person X coming into existence is bad for them, but good for increasing the net utility of the universe. I have a similar difficulty with what vegan space scientist has said on the topic. In this clip, for example,
I think that as a total hedonic utilitarian, where the only two things I care about are reducing suffering and maximizing pleasure, it's very hard for me to accept this argument.
he doesn't say who he cares about doing this for. Is it just the universe, abstractly? He has specifically said that if a child has more positive than negative in their life, then coming into existence is good for that individual.
I don't subscribe to the view that having a child is always a harm for the child. To back up a little bit, my ethical framework is total hedonic utilitarian. So if a child is born and they have a net positive life, as in they have more pleasure and well-being than suffering, I would think that's a good thing for that individual. Now, granted, if that child had more suffering than well-being, I would certainly accept that being born it was a harm for that individual.
But I do also wonder if this may be similar to Peter Singer, where he's actually conflating that with the net utility of the universe. What it comes down to for me, why I accept Benatar's asymmetry over this alternative, is because when we consider a planet like Mars, I don't consider the lack of Martian pleasure a bad thing. But I know vegan space scientists does. But I've never had anybody make a convincing case to me that I should. I think it just comes down to a difference in values. I'm sure we'll get round to talking at this at some point in the future. We do know each other personally. One final note on this utilitarian evaluation is that in his book, Better Never to Have Been, Benatar does actually make the case that life has overwhelmingly more bad than good. So the utilitarian evaluation still leads to anti-natalism if you accept that life is disproportionately bad. Some people may say that Benatar's original asymmetry comes with its own reductio. That is, that it is always a harm to come into existence. To this, all I can say that one man's reductio is another man's reason. Benatar's asymmetry is a lot easier for me to swallow than the alternatives, and rings true with my intuitions. Perhaps the same is not true for you. I've spoken with people who insist on the alternatives I've shown, but I don't find myself agreeing with them. Benatar raises the question of how we value coming into existence over never existing, and obviously people with a range of meta-ethical frameworks are going to come back with a range of responses. Benatar hasn't shared his normative ethics, but he has said he's not a utilitarian.
Are you a negative utilitarian?
No. A lot of people assume that my arguments are utilitarian, and I don't take them to be utilitarian.
What is your normative theory?
I'm not going to answer that question. I'm just going to say that my arguments for anti-natalism are theory neutral.
The Asymmetry describes his evaluation, and he's of the belief that most people share his view. I am a moral anti-realist. I don't believe anything is objectively good or bad. What the Asymmetry accomplishes for me is that it accurately describes how I value the event of coming into existence. Okay, that's it for this video, guys. This one actually took a lot of work, so if you could like and subscribe, that would be really appreciated. Thank you very much.